Welcome. I'm Joe Luff, and this is the Theology of Karl Marx. For those of you accessing this seminar online, we will be meeting every Sunday for the next 6 weeks at 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time in the C. Robbins Clark Library at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Berkeley. If you missed previous seminars, you will find a link to them online. Seminars will be mastered and posted on the course website as soon after each session as I can put them together. For those who need assistance accessing the seminar, you can email me at josephluff@gmail.com. The Theology of Karl Marx explores the theological foundations and implications of Karl Marx's critical theory of modern society. In the first seminar, we looked at the foundations of Christian materiality in biblical witness and in the faith attested to in the ecumenical creeds. In the second seminar, we examined how the formation of abstract time and value in the 13th century challenged the Christianity attested to in these creeds. We discovered the profound difference between the value we find in the substances out of which things are composed and the value composed out of the abstract time consumed in their composition. In today's seminar, we will explore how the Christian experience of value began to reshape how Christians experience the bodies of the Holy Mother and her divine Son. We will also look at how this new experience of value suppressed or altogether silenced sacred mirth. We will also look at how this new experience of value will shape divine violence. The suggested readings for today focus on the Christian body from the turn of the millennium through the 16th century. In the excerpt from Caroline Walker Bynum, we look at the growing instability of Christian materiality during this period. In Donna Spivey Ellington, we look more specifically at the fate of the Holy Mother's body. In Margaret Miles' Complex Delight, we look at this same body from another vantage point. In Peter Widdicombe, we look at the disappearing wounds of the ascended body of Christ during this period. And in Mikhail Bakhtin's Rabelais, we look at how the same violence to which Mary and her divine Son were being subjected also hit peasants and townsfolk where it mattered most, their sense of humor, sacred mirth. Sacred mirth may appear to be an outlier in this selection. What has the celebration of lower parts, of hidden parts, the fun-making of Carnival's upside-down world to do with the mother and her son? Next to the place of sacred mirth in this discussion, there is also the problem that Ellington and Miles appear to offer divergent, even conflicting interpretations of the fate of Mary's body. Miles focuses on the eroticization of Mary's body, while Ellington focuses on the spiritualization, the androgenization of Mary's body. A similar question arises within Widdicombe's study. By the 16th century, the glorified body of the Lord bears no evidence of its earthly sojourn. Not only are the wounds erased from this body, it is also stripped of any evidence of natality. No belly button and gender, no genitalia. This contrasts with the increasingly grotesque and macabre images of the Jesus from Le Chemin de la Croix up to the Ascension. A similar ambiguity clings to Walker Bynum's divine matter. On the one hand, this matter seems ill-equipped to contain its spiritual guest. This matter is not quite what it pretends to be. On the other hand, late medieval and early modern thinkers were eager to explain, and often explain away, this inadequacy in quasi-natural scientific terms, extending to inanimate matter qualities of living flesh, and to living flesh the qualities of pure mechanics. This ambiguity, I suggest, is not apparent but real, implicit in the social form then taking shape in Christendom. This novel social form was the commodity, a surface form appearance whose underlying abstract value form bears no relationship to the substances out of which commodities are composed. In commodity societies, it is not the underlying value form that is in question, but the surface form of appearance, whose value for this very reason proves increasingly enigmatic. Quote, "A commodity appears at first sight an extremely obvious, trivial thing, but its analysis brings out that it is a very strange thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties." So wrote Marx at the beginning of Capital, Volume 1. The peculiar character of the commodity was apparent in the isolation of its value form from its surface form of appearance, not as a symbol of something else, but as the embodiment of everything else, or rather as their aggregate immaterial abstract value. Once things became commodities, they, in Marx's words, transcended sensuousness. We will have much more to say about the commodity later in session 7. Here we want to point out how analytically this social form can help us make sense of the conflicting pictures of piety we find in late medieval and early modern Christianity. Let us look first at Walker Bynum's Christian materiality. Walker Bynum deployed a different set of analytical categories to grasp late medieval and early modern piety, different, that is, than the ones we are adopting here. Yet, let me suggest that what she is describing might better be understood as an expression of the commodity form. Walker Bynum begins by citing Nicholas of Cusa's lengthy critique of unauthorized Christian materiality. But if the problem was, as Cusanus alleged, that Christ's humanity was never divided or corrupted, this seemed to solve the problem of unauthorized relics. Yet, did it not also strike at the very heart of the gospel message and Eucharistic feast? As Walker Bynum points out, quote, ironically, Cusanus's approval of supposedly transformed objects rested on the claim to miraculous changelessness, the host's supposed resistance to the natural processes of decay and fragmentation. Does this not strike at the very heart of the Incarnation? Quote, issues of how matter behaved, she continues, both ordinarily and miraculously, when in contact with an infinitely powerful and ultimately unknowable God, were key to devotion and theology. The God who lay beyond the world in unimaginable and unanalyzable darkness or light was also a God to whom human beings were led back by a human Christ, a Christ whose substances, in the Eucharist, and even whose particles, in blood relics, might be present on earth. Nicholas found himself in a tight spot. Did he believe that it was God, God's self, who was revealed, not concealed in the incarnate Lord of all? And if so, why could not this incarnate, crucified, risen, and glorified God continue to convey God's self materially to the faithful through matter? But as Walker Bynum notes, the problem ran much deeper than this. Where Christians had traditionally sought and found God in things, they now increasingly sought and found God in selves, their selves, that they took to be transcendent and immaterial. This contradiction led to others. Quote, the increasing prominence of holy matter in a religion also characterized by a need for human agency on the part of the faithful, a return to interiority on the part of spiritual writers and reform-minded church leaders, and an upsurge of voluntarism, negative theology, and mysticism. What is it that was animating matter? What was bearing the material world forward or outward? What was revealed or concealed under surface forms of appearance? As Walker Bynum notes, In the later Middle Ages, the expression of and reaction to Christ's humanity, even his bodiliness, were part of a larger religious discourse about the material itself and how it might manifest or embody God. The Eucharist itself, Bynum notes, was Christ. Or was it? Walker Bynum states the problem well toward the end of the excerpt. Miraculous matter was simultaneously, hence paradoxically, the changeable stuff of not God and the locus of a God revealed. Walker Bynum makes a point of distinguishing the paradoxical from the dialectical. What is at play here, in her view, is no dialectic. But I want to linger on this disavowal for just a moment, for it exposes an important analytical inflection point, Later, in Margaret Miles' text, Miles will apply a fairly traditional class analysis to the fate of the Holy Mother's breast. In traditional Marxism, the Marxism of the Second International, history is felt to proceed dialectically. In the familiar language of the Communist Manifesto, feudalism, where royalty ruled, gives way to capitalism, where the bourgeoisie rule, gives way to communism, where the proletariat rules. In our view, the dialectic itself arises with the appearance of abstract value, or more to the point, it arises with the appearance of delta Q over delta L, change in quantity over a change in labor. The marginal product generates a specific social logic, a compulsion to produce more, delta Q, with less, delta L, more abstract value. Francis Fukuyama was therefore partly, but only partly correct to highlight thymos, the pursuit of pure prestige, as the drive behind the historic dialectic. The pursuit of the marginal product of abstract value discloses an entirely new logic. Investors achieve plateaus of productivity. New materials, new technology, new organization, new transportation, new clients, etc., achieve a greater marginal product. But as soon as this leap in productivity becomes socially generalized among all investors, its marginal product flattens for all, requiring another round of new materials, new technology, new organization, etc. This dialectic arises not between two classes, as in traditional Marxism. It is composed by the difference between surface form and value form immanent to all commodities. This means that the tension between surface and value form, to which Walker Bynum called attention, is not one that goes away or is superseded or overcome. It is immanent to the social form itself. Its dialectic is both directionally dynamic, generating material movement forward, but also purely cyclical in the sense that it returns to the exact same place, mathematically speaking, continuously, ad infinitum. Most importantly, this dialectic is not transhistorical. It did not drive history prior to the 14th century. It will not drive history after capitalism has become something else. Class is a consequence of this dialectic, not a cause. The paradox for Walker Bynum foregrounds in the paradox of the paradox of the commodity. Miraculous matter, she writes, was simultaneously, hence paradoxically, the changeable stuff of not God and the locus of a God revealed. We now turn to Donna Spivey-Ellington's research. In some ways, it reinforces Walker Bynum's research. Quote, The Church's portrait of the Virgin gradually changed during the 16th century. I would argue the change began 3 centuries earlier, and became less focused on her body and more on her soul, as religious life in Western Europe was increasingly dominated by a piety that stressed the inner life at the expense of the concrete and the material. Spivey Ellington explains the retreat of Mary's value from surfaces to underlying abstract interiors by pointing to increased literacy. She qualifies this variable with the literacy of the clergy. But even here, we need to wonder why the clergy's message of a more angelic, less embodied Mary would have proved increasingly attractive to Christians. In the late Middle Ages, Christians associated Mary with the full range of womanly powers, specifically giving birth, feeding, and nurturing the incarnate God, her Son. What Mary provided to her Son, she now provides for us. And the assistance we need that she cannot provide directly, she can provide because of her unique access as the Mother of God, Theotokos, she has to her Son. In the 13th century, this full range of womanly powers begins to atrophy. Mary's powers are depleted. In the Reformation, they are entirely eliminated. One might think that the Counter-Reformation would restore these powers. Instead, to quote Spivey Ellington, there is no mistaking the attempt by Counter-Reformation clergy to establish a more passive and spiritualized virgin, humble, obedient, prayerful, silent, and devoted to good works while on earth, interceding, still humbly, for the faithful once she reached heaven. As a model for the type of Catholic they hope to foster after Trent. Spivey Ellington cites Elizabeth Ripley's research in this regard, who noted the growing distrust of the body, which was so much a feature of the 17th century. Indeed, except that the suppression of the body actually took root and began to spread a good 2 centuries earlier. Jacob Sprenger's Malleus Malefactorum, the notorious witch-hunting manual, was published in the 1480s. By then, the Christian conquest and suppression of women's bodies was already in full swing. But again, this analysis itself is too one-sided. For the attack on women's bodies, beginning with the Holy Virgin, was itself accompanied by an inward contemplative turn. Divine grace, in all of its forms, retreats from surfaces into a transcendental interior, leaving graceful bodies open to attack. From here, Spivey Ellington leads her readers to a survey of scientific and quasi-scientific literature, Descartes, Copernicus, and Galileo, agreeing with Susan Bordeaux's research that Descartes' system was a masculine model of knowledge which eliminated aspects of participatory knowing, usually labeled feminine. As we will see next week, this heightened misogyny paralleled a heightened overall misanthropy, violence directed against all flesh, and it accompanied an unparalleled leap forward in commanding, controlling, and dominating nature. To protect the Church and to protect the Holy Virgin, the Mother of God was compelled to disavow her own body. She becomes a model of the ideal, which is to say, passive, silent, non-instrumental, modern woman. Spivey Ellington's research is amazing. I wish we could study it more closely. Okay, let's move on to Margaret Miles' Complex Delight. Miles is the perfect complement to Spivey Ellington's Mary, where Spivey Ellington's Mary is reduced to an androgynous Mary. Miles' Mary becomes the object of erotic titillation. But for this reason, Mary attracts suspicion. How precisely is she helping those who fixate on her breast? Is she feeding them? Is Is she satisfying them in some other way? If so, how? Interestingly, Miles reminds us of the gender symmetry, at least within the visual representations of the early Renaissance. So, for example, she notes that the resurrected Jesus often displays a full erect penis, an undeniable indication of life brought back from the dead. But, notes Miles, these portrayals of the Virgin and her Son created a tension between erotic attraction and religious meaning, and increasingly, a Virgin Mother with whom all Christians could identify is replaced by a Mother of God who bears no relation to actual women. Quote, women's identification with the Virgin's power was blocked by emphasis on the unbridgeable chasm between the ideal Virgin and actual women. But then Miles' argument takes an unexpected turn. Her point seems to be that women lost their place in public life. Where in the Middle Ages they had accompanied their husbands, fathers, and sons to the fields and forests, they now were relegated to the home. Where home-based manufacturing had placed women alongside men, workhouse manufacturing left them behind. But this was only partly true, and it points up a weakness in Miles' argument, which is largely based on the experience of bourgeois, middle and upper middle class women. Because at the lowest level, women continued to assume employment in public, deep in mine shafts, in public houses, on threshing floors, and in textile mills, where the wages they earned were half the wages offered to men and comparable to the wages offered to their children. Miles is certainly correct that the character of the market was subject to dramatic change, and that this change proved especially unfavorable to poor women. But the cause for this change was not the market itself. Rather, the market was changed by manufacturing, and manufacturing was changed by a changing experience of value. Unless we subscribe to spontaneous generation, material wealth does not produce more material wealth. Rather, was it a shift in how Christians were experiencing value that brought a dramatic increase in productivity, in the marginal product, and in what investors believed they were investing. But the same shift in social subjectivity that brought investors to focus their attention on the marginal product also brought Christians in general to devalue surface forms of appearance and turn their attention inward. As Miles notes, religious vitality was not incompatible with rapid secularization. Indeed, the shift of value from surfaces to the interior signaled open season on bodies of all kinds, women's bodies, men's bodies, but also the earth and its seemingly endless bounty of resources. The increasing popularity of flagellation, the simultaneous eroticization and androgenization of the bodies of Mary and her Son, and the growing overall instability of divine materiality point to a system-wide transformation in how Christians were experiencing value. We now need to move on to Peter Whitcomb's piece, whose main weakness is the absence of an analytical frame. That said, it flawlessly documents the thesis we have been exploring during this seminar. Up until the 13th century, Christians everywhere trusted that Jesus retained his wounds in his glorified body. In the late Middle Ages, their trust wavered. By the early modern period, Jesus' body was completely stripped of its wounds. Whitcomb's evidence is ironclad. All he lacks is an explanatory framework. In our view, the question of flesh in heaven, or more broadly, of incarnation, is as old as the world itself. Remember, Adam and Eve hear God's footsteps. Really? And in some ascetic binary cosmologies, spirit and flesh are felt to occupy two different opposing poles. It's fully true. The point is that for 10 millennia, this was not the case for the people of Israel. And for over 1 millennia, it was also not the case for Christians. So what changed? We turn last to Bakhtin's Rabelais, because it is often difficult for historians to assess how peasants in the market or square experienced value. Mikhail Bakhtin offers an answer. They experienced God in the form of sacred mirth, mostly during festival days, during Carnival. But as he points out, Christians in the marketplace and countryside experienced festival days, feast days, Carnival, nearly 2/3 of every year. What did they experience during these festivals? They experienced, according to Bakhtin, a world turned upside down, where the lower parts, the hidden parts, were placed up at the top and were exposed, where those at the top of the income hierarchy and the power hierarchy were placed under those generally thought of as at the bottom. Good humor meant poking fun at the Pope, the Prince, and those in high places. It meant elevating those beneath. It meant exposing sexuality and excretion and the grotesque over the beautiful, the righteous, and the pure. We don't have enough time today to go into any detail of Bakhtin's Rabelais, except to say this same transformation that was currently taking place in official Christendom was also taking place in the streets and in the countryside. That is to say, by the end of this period, laughter will have changed. The church will have completely suppressed Carnival, will have domesticated it, and humor will have retreated into the bordello and into the bar and pub, which is to say, Carnival is about to be eradicated in most of Christendom, and the feast day is going to be sanitized. That is to say, all of the impurities removed. So what does it mean generally to say that value is vacating surface forms of appearance, or that value is retreating to the interior? Well, as we'll see next week, one of the most valuable lessons of the retreat of value is that it is now open season on bodies of all kinds. We'll see how this strikes bodies in the physical world, where extraction will become justifiable and justified on the basis of Scripture. But we'll also see how bodies of all kinds, men's bodies and women's bodies, and sadly also the bodies of those whom Europeans are now invading in the Americas and in Asia, become subject to extreme divine violence based on Scripture. So I hope you'll be able to join me next week, where we discuss the origins of modern divine violence. Thanks for joining me today. If you want to learn more, you can always contact me at josephluff@gmail.com.